home inspector check it out. So they would often have a list of referrals because they'll know after a certain amount of time you look at these roofs, and the good roofs all typically are the same contractor. Then you kind of have a list because your clients will often ask you, hey, I have these problems with whatever system, who can I talk to? It's something that you can provide.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, a regular discussion with building industry professionals. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Paul Barraza, home inspector and owner of JMC Inspections. You can find the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. You can leave feedback and ask questions there too. Well, Paul, you are a brave man. You are facing the gauntlet of FHB versus home inspectors, and you wrote in because you feel like the brand has unfairly criticized the industry, and you are here to help us understand better what you do.
I'll give my shot here.
What made you want to do this? It seems like a thankless job.
Well, I've enjoyed Fine Homebuilding since the first episode, so it's something that I've learned a lot from. And obviously, it's not the brand versus home inspections. There's people who've had life experiences, you and maybe some of the other podcast people. So I just feel like it's not necessarily competition or some kind of antagonistic thing. It's just we've had people with bad experiences, or maybe don't quite understand what the industry is. So I'm just happy to do my best to share what I know.
Well, I agree with your sentiments. It's definitely not antagonism. I appreciate your willingness to talk to us. I think it's going to be great. Can you tell me about your business and how you became a home inspector?
Yeah, so we do residential, commercial home inspections, a little bit of consulting work on the side. We are in the Berkeley, California, but we work in the East Bay, and generally we're coming out providing a report, and in our market, it's typically people are selling their homes and not so much that are for the buyers. Obviously, the industry has shifted quite a bit over the years. When I started off in 2006, but the industry has shifted kind of from the buyer side to the seller side.
So I'm going to interrupt you for a sec. So your goal is to tell sellers what they should address before putting their home on the market. Is that correct?
Partially, it's about strategy, but it's also about disclosure. So in California, there's pretty strong disclosure laws. So basically, you want to say, hey, this is what we have. You have a thorough inspection report. If there's something that's wrong, they can say, well, here we are. It's disclosed that everyone now knows that this thing is happening. But also, sellers can strategize. Sometimes if it's something that might concern buyers, the agents will maybe get a bid or a quote, or maybe if, an engineer or whatever expert to come out and say, this might be an area of concern, because the agents are kind of the experts on the market and what the buyers may want or may be concerned about. So once you disclose everything out front, then there's less back and forth. There's less haggling. There's obviously it's a smoother transaction. So that's kind of where everything's been shifting. How
did you become a home inspector?
Well, I had a friend who was a home inspector, and this is about 2006. This is when the previous bubble, and home inspections are great. You should get into it. And I thought it was interesting. And then I bought my own house in 2006. Of course, that was in the bubble, but I had a home inspection, and the guy came out and super nice. But at the same time, I was like, oh, this isn't this thing that's shrouded in mystery. Like I could do this if I wanted to. So then I took a class. It was like one of these 2-week classes supposed to teach you everything you need to know. And the first thing I learned was like, okay, it's going to take way more than 2 weeks to figure out what's going on here. So, we had some great instructors in the class. Douglas Hansen, who helps with the Code Check series, is one of the primary instructors at the time. And then I just hooked up with one of the teachers who was looking to hire. So I basically was an apprentice. And that was how I learned. I think there's a lot of knowledge, obviously, that's about general buildings, but a lot of inspections is about local knowledge. Like if I had a house in this neighborhood built in this year, how would that be built? What kind of methods they use? Was there knob and tube wiring? So learning that kind of local knowledge is just as critical as knowing how houses are built.
What are some of the typical things that folks worry about where you're at? What are some of the common problems?
Well, earthquakes is one.
Yeah. So do you go under homes and see if they've been retrofitted for seismic concerns?
Absolutely. So as an inspection, we are Every chance we get, we're going to get on the roof unless it's not safe. We're going to make every effort to get on the roof. We'll get into every crawl space. We'll squeeze into the smallest spaces we can get. Obviously, there's limitations and there's
Hmm.
times where it's not accessible. But looking at the foundation, putting your hands on the roof, checking for the main elements of retrofit. And I think when I started in 2006, a lot of people were like, oh, well, why do I need a retrofit? Like, do I really need this? Now all the buyers I talk to, oh yeah, it totally makes sense. There's no pushback at all. Um, and then as the inspection industry and knowledge evolves, people are thinking about more like, well, what about wildfires or there's other things that we're dealing with these days. So it does, yeah, it kind of evolves over time.
Can you talk about ASHI, the American Society of Home Inspectors? Is that right?
Yep,
Um,
yep.
how many members, and is there a code of conduct and are their professional expectations to be a member?
For sure, yeah. So I just checked with them. There's about 6,000 members. There's three levels of membership. So if someone says I'm a member of ASHI, it's kind of like, okay, that's great. What kind of membership is it? So anybody off the street can join ASHI. That's what's called a member, and that's when you're first starting out. You got to learn the industry, and then as an inspector, I think it's 50 inspections, and then there's a certification process where you're submitting reports. You're having to pass tests about the standards of practice, which is what we follow. There's also a code of ethics that we have to follow. And then the highest level is ASHI ACI, what's called ASHI Certified Inspector. And that's a certification that's been accredited by um, the National Commission of Certifying Agencies. So that's something that, of all the different inspection organizations, there's lots of them out there. People are members of different ones. ASHI ACI is the only one that's actually accredited by to say, hey, is this a real quality designation, as opposed to someone saying, hey, I can, Patrick McComb can create their own organization and say, pay me $1,000 and I'll give you a nice shiny badge. So,
Let's do that later, Jeff.
okay.
So is that pretty strenuous? Is it hard to get that certification?
It's not. I mean, I think if you're diligent, you can do the study. If you have experience as a remodeling contractor, it takes time, and you have to, the code of ethics is pretty straightforward. Like you can't have a conflict of interest. These things hopefully would make sense for most people. If you're an experienced contractor, the National Home Inspection Exam should be pretty straightforward. It might be a few things that trip you up. It just takes time. And there's other. I'm also a member of the local, or it's not local, but state organization that is called CREA, which is the California Real Estate Inspection Association, and they have a type of membership that requires 1,000 inspections as opposed to 250, and you have to pass all the same 4 code exams that a building inspector would. So there's
That seems
different
pretty
levels.
strenuous. Yeah.
Yeah, that one is for sure. I mean, not very
Yeah.
many people get that one. But it's also, there's different designations, and that one, when I found out about it, I'm like, well, this actually means something, right? So it's actually valuable, and so when that time came, I went and got that.
And how many folks have that certification in California? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah,
Is
it's
it
probably
dozens or hundreds?
no. I would guess 10-15% of all the Korea members, something like that. But don't take my word for that. You have to double check.
You, in your email to the podcast, you said, I've been dismayed by the general dismissal of the home inspection profession, both in the magazine, Gary Katz's article specifically in 2014, and on the podcast, episode 374, and a few earlier episodes. So what are we getting wrong, Paul? What is unfair or what inaccurate about what we've said?
Yeah. Well, if my memory serves, Gary had a problem with going on. There was a bit of the crawl space that he found damage in, and the home inspection report didn't note that. So this is, of course, what his article is saying. Like I said, when are doing inspections, we're making every effort to go on the roof in the crawl space. If in the way the standards of practice works, if you couldn't get to an area, then you'd have to state that in the report. Like if the crawl space was inaccessible or the door was locked, if the clearances were too low, these are things you need to put in the report. So hopefully, the inspector said that I couldn't get in the crawl space or a certain part of the crawl space for a certain reason. I don't obviously know the details. And if, that's so sometimes there's problems with the inspectors not necessarily being as thorough as they should. Sometimes there's a problem with the expectations of the client saying, oh, yeah, this person's going to be able to get to everywhere. They can see through walls. We get stuff like, hey, there was this, missed problem with the wiring in the wall. Why didn't you see that? And you say, well, it's because it was in the wall. We can't see. We don't have X-ray specs that sometimes people think. So sometimes a problem with expectations because they're not clearly laid out. And sometimes it's inspectors who maybe are just peeking in the crawl space cover, or maybe using a ladder to look at the edge, or sometimes they look at they inspect the roof from the ground, which I don't really think you can do that from the ground. So yeah,
How do you find a good inspector then? I mean, oftentimes these relationships come through a real estate agent, and I think you'd
yeah,
agree that they have an incentive to get the deal done. They don't want to pick an inspector who's going to be especially critical of the house and stop the transfer.
yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Well, there are definitely good realtors, and there's realtors who just want to get the deal done. And over time, I've been able to, and lucky enough to work with the ones who really just want to do it right and get all the disclosures done properly. But as a buyer or as a seller, I guess it's true. But when your realtor suggests a home inspector, they should be suggesting or recommending more than one, so maybe two to three. And then you, as a owner of the house or the buyer, can do some research. Some states are licensed, so obviously that's a minimum thing you need to have licensing. Looking for some sort of professional organization such as ASHI or CREA. And then I would recommend reading the reports, because some people think a good report is like 100, 150 pages. We actually strive to keep our reports very streamlined so that someone can actually read them and understand them without a lot of extra fluff. So reading the reports, you'll actually learn a lot about how the
So you
inspector
would
does their work.
suggest to ask a potential home inspector for a sample
Yeah,
report? Yeah.
I think
Okay.
I think most of them would have a sample on their website. If they didn't, you can just call them and say, "Hey, can you send me a sample report?" Because that a lot of it's the communication of what is going on with the house. How is it easy to read? Is it easy to understand? Is there a lot of jargon? You have to be able to understand it at the end of the day for it to be valuable for you.
Do
Um,
you think in the effort to make things understandable to most folks that it's dumbed down? Can you have something that's both comprehensive and easy to understand?
I think so. It's not easy to do that, but you can definitely do it. And we kind of have two audiences in our reports. One is the client, so we need to make it relatable to someone who doesn't necessarily know a lot about houses. But the second audience is the trade world. So if we're saying there's a plumbing issue, the client needs to understand that. Then hopefully they're sending that on to the plumber. So when the plumber reads it, they can understand that it's technically correct. And you're not using words that are so dumbed down that they're like, "Oh, this guy is what the hell is this
Yeah,
guy
I don't know
talking
what to
about?"
fix, right? They need to be able
Yeah,
to understand what the real problem is.
yeah. hmm
What about what are there other things that people can do to kind of
To find a good
try on
inspector.
a home inspector to see if it's a good fit and if they're going to do a good job?
Yeah, so the other things I already listed, the cheapest inspector is probably not going to be the best inspector. So just
Hmm.
like in the trades, people want things to be done for very cheap. It's the same in the inspection world. So if someone is expensive, there's usually a good reason, whether it's experience or expertise or whatever it may be, that they're doing that. So expecting, a home inspection for $200 that's going to be high quality is probably an unreasonable expectation.
So I've had three experiences during real estate transfers with home inspectors. They weren't bad, but not very edifying. I think many of the professionals who listen to this podcast would know at least as much as their home inspector. Why do you think that they should be required to get one by their lender, or should they be?
Right. To my knowledge, a lot of lenders in this area don't require them, and that might be different parts of the country. A lot of times, like I said, we're doing them for listing, just for disclosures. Obviously, the lenders got the money, so they get to make the rules as far as what they require.
That's a
So
good
it's,
point.
you can, if you pay cash, there's no lender to worry about. But I'm not sure who can do that exactly. um, but yeah, I think it's important for. Yeah, I just think it's people like Mike Garrison, I don't think he would get a lot of value out of a home inspection report, right? Honestly. So, in our market, you're really trying to get a report out that discloses everything, so that you don't know who's going to read it. You could have an expert contractor come and buy the house. You could have someone who's lived in a condo their whole lives and doesn't know how to lift a finger to do anything. So, you don't know if there's going to be kids. You don't know if there's going to be, um, elderly folks in the house. And as experienced as a lot of the contractors can be, there often can be some nuggets of information about some defective brands that happened 30 years ago that maybe they just never ran into, where a home inspector is seeing, hundreds of homes every year is more experienced or maybe plugged into that community that knows about such things.
That's where you're talking about the local expertise is invaluable.
Yeah,
You're seeing homes of the same era, and you might look at dozens of them or hundreds of them and know their
e-
likely problems.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. In my case, the buyer's inspector found several things when I sold a house in Vermont. What they flagged seemed rather arbitrary, like they were just trying to make a list of things. And for example, he insisted that the copper conductors that connect to the ground rods from the electrical panel and the service entrance be in conduit. And that's completely bogus, I know. And I did it because you don't want to kill a deal, right? And it seemed easy enough to satisfy him. The other thing was he decided that the hot water heater needed to have a pressure balancing, or excuse me, a tempering valve, so the tank temperature could be kept high enough to prevent the growth of Legionella bacteria.
Yeah.
And once again, I don't think that's a real code requirement. It kind of ticked me off, but I don't feel like you have a lot of recourse in these situations. What would you tell someone like me that feels like they're the victim of someone's arbitrary whims?
Well, you could have had a listing inspection, but I know that probably in your market that wasn't something that was happening. I think it's important to remember that for example, you're very well versed in the code, so you're saying, "Hey, this isn't a code requirement." But home inspectors are not code inspectors, so we don't. We're the city or the local jurisdiction. They are the code inspector. They get to decide what is code. We're home inspectors. We're providing a professional opinion. Obviously, our professional opinion is based on the code and work experience and a lot of other things. For example, the code might say you can have a deck without a railing at 29 inches, but is that necessarily safe? I mean, we still say we recommend a railing, so we're not bound by the code, and we're not code inspectors. So that's obviously something that comes up quite a bit. We're saying, hey, this guy should only be talking about code things, but we're not code inspectors because the bottom at the end of the day is really up to the building department because they get to decide how to interpret the code, and that's obviously a point of contention how different people interpret it different ways.
Mm. So you're saying that that buyer's home inspector was just pointing out that there was a risk of Legionella, and whether it was code or not, they were
Yeah,
just pointing that out to the client.
and
That,
maybe there. I don't know how hot the water was. So obviously, if you're testing the water and it's 130, 140 more degrees, then there's a tempering valve would be a solution for that.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, you're winning me over here, man. I don't
No,
know.
I'm one question at a time. Doing my best.
You also wrote, I believe most home inspectors work hard to provide thorough inspections and insightful inspection reports. If someone were to have a bad experience with a contractor, does that mean all contractors are bad? Of course not. And the same is true for home inspectors. It's a fair point, but how can home buyers be sure they're getting a qualified inspector? And you mentioned some of the things already, but do you have like 3 or 4 points? You said accreditation, talk to your friends for
Yeah.
referrals. Are there
Yeah.
other things?
I think we covered it. Mainly, obviously there's minimums that people need to have for depending on your state. California is not a licensed state, but many are. Having professional accreditations, obviously that means something. Like I said, some or just like I can go online and get one, and some are actually a little more rigorous. So sample reports is something that not very many people do. And as a buyer, again, you're kind of under the gun. Like you might have a limited amount of time, so you don't necessarily have the luxury of reading these reports, but that can teach you a lot. Basics like E&O insurance. So we're a professional, so we need to have or should have E&O insurance because
Errors
it's
and omissions, we should tell folks who are unfamiliar.
correct. Exactly. Yeah. So and then just expecting a good inspection for a cheap price is not reasonable.
My brother's most recent home inspection, I guess he bought his house about 8 years ago, included a home inspector. This inspector hired a plumber, an electrician, a pest control expert, and a structural engineer to help him evaluate the house. To me, this makes more sense than a single individual. What do you think about this approach? Would that worry you? Would that be too expensive? Would people balk?
No, if people want to know, they should know. And so if they want to hire a team, that's a great way to go. I mean, in the commercial world, the team inspection is way more common. You don't just have one guy with a tool belt out there, one guy or gal, I should say. It's, a lot of times commercial, they have an engineer, they have the general inspector, which is what kind of the home inspector would be in the commercial world. They have HVAC guys because you could have 20, 30 package units on the roof. So they do more of a team approach. I think in the home inspection world, obviously the stakes are a little bit lower. And the home inspector can come in as kind of like the general practitioner, where you're saying, "Hey, I see these issues with the HVAC. You know,
Get
I'm
an
recommending."
expert. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, if you have the time, they can kind of spot the areas where it might be a good idea to have an engineer come out because they'll know, for especially earthquake retrofits, there's some retrofits that are like, this is a flat lot, it's pretty simple. And there's standard plans for dealing with this, but then you're on a hillside, you might have a house over a garage. And okay, well, yeah, this is a situation where you need an engineer or a plumber. You have 20 issues with plumbing. It's like, well, at a certain point, I'm not going to list all these. You really need a plumber to come out and look at the whole house.
Is that something you find yourself doing, or do you make the client make that reach out to those experts, or does it vary?
Yeah, in the commercial world, we set it all up beforehand where they decide, okay, I really want an expert for these at different areas, and then we'll all come together. But
Mm.
generally, in the home inspection world, we let them know what's going on, and then they usually discuss it with a realtor to say, hey, what are these? What items would it be helpful for the sale to get other experts out to put the buyers at ease?
Does your firm have more than one inspector presently?
Yeah, so we have myself, obviously, I'm out in the field still doing inspections, and we have two inspectors. I have two inspectors working for me. One of them is newer and is in training, so it's a bit of a process. But yeah, no, I started working for that John McComas all those years ago, which is why it's called JMC Inspections. It was a great experience apprenticing with him and learning the industry. Eventually, he rode off into the sunset, and now I'm, now I'm, yeah. So I bought the company from him, and I think it's really helpful to have it. We don't typically inspect together unless it's a larger apartment building or commercial, but it is nice to have a team. You can bounce ideas off each other, that kind of thing.
Especially with modern technology, they can send you a picture on their phone and you can review it
Yep.
immediately. That has got to be hugely helpful in your business.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the reports are all PDF, so we can discuss them, and they can send over a folder with the pictures. And we can talk about things, and for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. But you inevitably will get these things like, okay, what is this? What's going on here? And I have to say, I'm also a member of the local inspection chapter, so that local knowledge. We're all technically competitors in this chapter, but we work together. You'll see things in the inspection, and you're like, I really know what this is, or what's your take on this? You just get the most invaluable information from this group, and it's kind of a community, maybe like Fine Homebuilding forums or Keep Craft Alive, where these things are, people are helping each other out, and it's something where one bad inspector or a bad inspection report can really bring down the industry. And if we work together to make it better, it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Mm. In your email, you also wrote, lastly, I think being on the Pro Talk podcast would be valuable since many contractors forced to hang up their tool belts due to worn out knees or other health issues and turn to home inspections as a second career. It's a great way to put their years of hard earned experience and knowledge to work. I totally agree with you. Can I assume that your home inspections are a second career for you, or is this
Yeah.
something you started out wanting to do?
I don't think anybody starts off wanting to be a home inspector, but no, it is a second career. I don't think it's kind of like Rumpelstiltskin. I don't think you'd ever guess what I did beforehand. It was
I do want to know, though.
I managed a rock climbing gym, which of course
Cool.
is the most common path to being a home inspector. Uh, but it's interesting. I'm a member of my local chapter, and you listen to these guys for all these years. You go, oh, that particular person, that must be an old HVAC contractor. You talk to them like, oh no, I worked at an auto shop. You're like, oh, okay. And so it's very helpful to be a remodeling contractor to get into the business, but it's not required if you're willing to put in the work and do the research, because inevitably you'll come into something you don't know. But now all this information is online, or you can talk to your fellow inspectors through the chapter or whatever else. But I think for the older contractors who are it's maybe physically difficult to keep working, there's an incredible amount of knowledge there that can be passed on to the next generation. These people typically work for themselves. They don't necessarily want to work for a company, so a lot of them will start being home inspectors. And it's I think it's as you get older in the construction world, it gets to be kind of a liability because you can't necessarily do the work. But as an inspector, like if you show up with gray hair, you get instant credibility, which isn't true in a lot of, like, here in California. If you're in the tech industry, if you're a gray hair, you're pretty much seen
Right.
as
You're a dinosaur.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just passing that knowledge on to the next generation, and you can really help the homeowners, the buyers. I mean, this is, I like the direct connection I have with the people I work for. There's not a lot of middle management and corporateness, if that's a word, to it. You just have a direct connection. You help these people out, and they'll see you spending 2 or 3 hours, crawling in around the house, and they really appreciate that. So it is rewarding in that way.
You also said, I got a lot of anxious clients who are worried about forest fires and climate change. And you say, hey, I'm in California after all. And of course, it's a huge issue where you are,
Yeah.
everywhere for that matter. I wanted to let people know that they can retrofit their houses to help combat these issues. So are you looking for that? Are you looking for open soffits and combustible materials and that kind of stuff?
We're not getting too deep into it, but there are obviously things that we're giving them a general idea. So if in Berkeley, there's areas where there's in the flats, and then there's other parts of the hills. So the hillside areas are definitely more prone to that thing. So do they have crawl space vents that have these very large openings that can let in embers, right? We're kind of doing a rudimentary, just kind of, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Obviously, it's important to what they call home hardening, right? So uh, when I talk to people like, "Are you ready for a potential wildfire?" The general answer is yes. I have my go bag. I'm ready to go, which is
But
important.
not they. You mean the house, and they mean
Right.
like me, right?
Yeah. Well, but
Yeah.
it's important. You would need to be ready for any
Sure.
emergency, whether it's earthquake. But then I think people don't realize that, yeah, there's all these things I can do. I can, the siding type. Obviously, having wood shingles in a fire area is not a great siding. I think everyone's been putting on Class A roofs for as far the last
Decades
20
now,
years.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's not so crazy. But there's lots of things that, people, instead of feeling like they're subject to these dangers, and the dangers are still there, they can be active. So there's things they can do to harden their home, as well as obviously make defensible space. So you can harden your home all you want to. If you have a giant tree right next to it, the radiant energy is probably going to overwhelm that. But there's active things that they can do, so they're not just a victim. They can actually be proactive and do these things. And a lot of that same true for the climate change people. Oh, this is really bummer, and nobody's doing anything about it or whatever. They say, well, you can use your home as a tool to fight climate change. You don't have to wait for everyone else to do it. Like, you're using energy, you're burning fossil fuels. You can use your home as, a tool in the fight if you wanted to. I mean, obviously, that's not something everyone wants to do, but that's what it's not something they can just sit on the sidelines. They can get in and do something themselves. And then there's arguments that people make. Well, for a small house, and is it really cost effective to put a solar system on or whatever else? But um, a lot of ways, like those people who were putting on solar panels 20 years ago, they weren't doing it because it made money for them or it was cost effective. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do, and that helped create a market where now people would get solar panels just because it makes financial sense, not necessarily because they care one way or another about climate change.
Do you think that's a potential growth for your industry, like helping people make their homes more resilient? Do you think that's a potential for the home inspection business in the future?
I think there is a bit of a gap as far as, like, for example, we had Steve Quarles, who's kind of one of the experts in how wildfires affect houses, and he spoke to our chapter. I'm like, who do we really recommend to come out and say, like, talk about home hardening or defensible space? And he said there's not really a great industry in that regard right now. So if home inspectors, we do extra services a lot of times. We'll do the basic home inspection, but sometimes some home inspectors do sewer inspections and other additional services. So, adding that kind of thing, if there's a gap in the industry to help inform people, I think is an opportunity for home inspectors for sure.
So here we go. This is my favorite part of the show. Can you tell me about your own house? Do you have any new or lingering problems that your home inspection revealed that you haven't fixed yet?
Well, for all the problems, we might need another podcast if you have the time for that. And the home inspection wasn't too crazy. It did reveal a water heater from the 50s that didn't have a TPRV valve.
Oh my gosh.
So
So how long ago was this, Paul? When
2006. So
Okay.
it was an ancient. It kind of should have been in a museum at that point.
That's incredible.
So we got money to get a new water heater. But as far as projects, yeah, basically my home is the test kitchen, as it were, and if there's anything that needs to be done, I could definitely hire people, but I'd rather just do it myself, and it helps inform me. I was the kid who was it was always in the basement with messing with my dad's tools and that kind of thing. So it's way more interesting for me to learn how to do it. And we re-roofed last summer during the pandemic. Normally we'd go on a summer vacation, but summer vacation turned into putting a new roof on.
So that was
And
you and
yeah,
the
and
family. Did
my
you?
yeah, my wife, my 8-year-old son, and a couple. I'm a climber, so a lot of my friends came out there. Very comfortable walking around roofs. So it's it's the 2-week vacation is a little different when you're re-roofing the house. But we find 5 layers of roofing. That also makes it a
Oh
little different
no,
too.
5?
Yeah.
Oh my
So
gosh.
and
Well, I
so
bet
we
that was a surprise.
yeah.
I bet you were cursing your home inspector at that point.
Well, I knew there was. I always thought there was at least 3. I thought maybe we could have 4. It was the old wood shingles from 1916, and they just kept adding on shingles every 15, 20 years or whatever it was. But that the reason we did the roofing is because we want to put solar on, and now
Yeah.
we're switching out all our appliances. So we're getting rid of the gas furnace, we're getting rid of the gas dryer, gas range. So that's the process of putting all that in. So last winter we didn't have a furnace, but who's counting?
You live in Berkeley, dude. It's
Yeah,
fine.
we did. Yeah, well, it's kind of like camping. You put on a warm jacket.
Jeez.
So it's always a work in progress. The house is never in any danger of being complete. I'll put it that way. So
So you like the stuff, obviously. You
yeah,
wouldn't put your own roof on if you didn't.
no, it's. I always my whole life have been curious how things work. So if you have that attitude, like you're just curious, you want to know how things work. You can again when you're doing a project, half of the fun is diving in and reading the specs and making the options. And I'm working with a energy performance contractor that I know, and it's like I'm just basically using him as a consultant. So I'm not just winging it. So I'll have him come out and say, hey, what do you think about this? And he pointed me in the right directions for the different equipment and getting the manual J, manual D, manual S, all that kind of stuff. So it's really, it really helps me as an inspector, but it's also, and maybe I'm crazy, but it's kind of fun too. So
No, it's cool. It's very cool.
yeah,
So what kind of roof did you put on? Did you put metal shingles?
no, just comp shingle. Yeah,
Okay.
keep it simple. I'm not necessarily the. I mean, I think metal roofing is the way to go for a lot of areas, especially if you're in the mountains. But for me, I'm not necessarily an early adopter. Like if things have been working for a while, I'm just going to stick to that. And obviously, in our climate, it's not. We don't really have a. It's not very hot, so
It's not as hot as Southern California
yeah,
where you'd see more of them,
no,
I'm sure. Yeah.
yeah, or having reflective roof shingles or all these things. That's usually in the summer. It's just foggy for most of the day, which is something I like.
Are you a native Californian?
Yeah, I grew up nearby, and my parents still live in their house from the 1968. And when they bought in 1968, it's an older house, but yeah, so they're nearby, and so I definitely know the area, and yeah, this is
Well, I've enjoyed talking to you. It's been great.
yeah.
Do you want to
Well,
ask or tell anything to our audience before we part company?
I was going to bring up one more point for referrals. A lot of times I remember you guys were asking about it's tough to find referrals, and I found situations where um, I go on the roof and I talk to the roof and I say, hey, or I don't talk to the roof. I look at the roof and I talk to the homeowner and I say, who is your roofer? And they, oh, I love my roofer. This guy was great. And I said, what did you like about the roofer? Oh, they cleaned up every day and they were super nice. And so a lot of times you're talking to homeowners or maybe people who aren't in the trades, they have referrals, but as a home inspector, we're looking at the roof a completely different way. And so
So
you
you're
have
saying is that it's not enough to like your roofer, but they should be doing a good job.
right, yeah. I mean, having a nice roofer is definitely a good starting point. So if you've just bought a house, for example, typically in most of the country you would have a home inspector check it out. So they would often have a list of referrals because they'll know after a certain amount of time you look at these roofs and the good roofs all typically are the same contractor. Then you kind of have a list because your clients will often ask you, "Hey, I have these problems with whatever system. Who can I talk to?" It's something that you can provide. So that's just you talk about realtors or maybe friends, but I think you know other
You
than
see
those
everyone's work
resources,
is a
yeah,
good point, right? You get to see who's doing
yeah,
a good job, and it might not be the friendly guy.
Right, exactly. It could be the old crusty contractor who, as long as you don't have to talk to them, they're going to do a great job.
I know a
So,
lot of
because
guys like that.
yeah, and there's different people. Like sometimes I work with clients who are maybe engineers or whatever else. They're very detail oriented. Like maybe I know certain contractors that would kind of fit that personality who are willing to go take the deep dive. Or some owners like I don't want to deal with it, just let them do everything. Then I can recommend different people for that.
That's a good point.
So
So you're saying ask your home inspector after you get the report, like who should fix this stuff.
yeah, if they have recommendations, and they might have some, but if they don't have any on at the ready, they can always ask their network and figure that out. So that's something that we provide. I would suspect people in different parts of the country do the same. I don't know that for sure, but it's something that people, we try to have an ongoing relationship. Like we provided this inspection report for you, then you do hopefully do address work, the things that are in the report, and I get emails from clients 3-5 years after the fact to say we've got these contractors now, we're going to phase 2 or phase 3, and it helps me because then I recommend people, and sometimes contractors they're great for a while, then they stop answering the phone or they're retired or whatever it may be, and so it helps me help
Stay
update
current.
my
Yeah.
list. Yeah.
Yeah. That was great. Well, I tell you what, I'm not going to paint all home inspectors with the same brush anymore, Paul. I promise.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that because there are just like contractors. That my main point in my ranting email that I appreciate that you read was that yeah, there are good inspectors and bad inspectors, just like there are good contractors, bad contractors. Obviously, the ones I think that you hear on Fine Homebuilding or in the magazine are kind of the cream of the crop, and that's the same for home inspection world as well. So I think there is a subset of people who are reading your magazine that aren't necessarily homeowners, they're not necessarily contractors. They're more of the consultant, inspector, engineer, category that are definitely reading it for information, and you know, we can be included next time.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Paul. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Paul for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. That helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Paul, you were great.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one, Patrick.
Take care, man.